Hello and welcome to part 2 of our 5-part video series. In this video, we'll be covering computer assembly. So, let's get started. Now that we have all our components, it's time to start putting things together. But first, we need to prep the case before we put anything into it. First, you need to remove the side panels by taking out the screws in the back of the case along the sides. Once that's done, remove both panels on both sides so we can open up the case. Then remove any of the items or boxes that may have come with the case. These will include screws, little pieces of hardware, and wires and so forth. A piece that you will need that came with the motherboard is a small aluminum piece of metal with holes cut into it. These holes are designed to fit around the external ports of the motherboard. What you need to do is insert the piece of metal into the back of the case and push it in securely so it locks in place. When properly installed, it should be very well secured and look like the image provided. At the front of the case, you need to remove one of the rectangular shaped panels. This can be done by pressing the two clips securing each panel to the inside of the case. It is recommended that you remove the topmost panel for ease of access. On the inside of the case, you need to prep securing pegs to the inside wall of the case to hold the motherboard in place. They are often small brass screws that came in a package with the case. Be sure to match the screw holes of the motherboard to the location of the brass pegs. In this scenario, this image shows raised pieces of metal where the motherboard will sit, so the pegs are not needed for this case, but may be required for others. Now that the case is fully prepped, it's time to start prepping the motherboard. The first thing we're going to do is install the processor into the motherboard. First, you need to remove the latch covering the motherboard processor socket, and then place the processor into that socket very carefully. Now the processor is in place, resecure the covering latch so it will hold the processor in place from now on. Now it's time to install the processor's heatsink. This piece of metal with a fan on top is very important. When a processor is on, it generates an incredible amount of heat, and if it gets too hot, it could shut down the whole computer to prevent damage to itself due to overheating. The stuff in the little white package is thermal paste, a group of material that transfers heat from the processor to the heatsink more effectively. Normally, new heatsinks have the thermal paste already attached to the bottom of them, but I'm adding a little extra. Place the thermal paste on top of the secured processor and spread it around the center of the processor with a toothpick. Then place the heatsink directly over top the processor. Some heatsinks have screws, but standard heatsinks have pins you push in. Press down these pins until you hear a distinct clicking noise notifying you that they are fully secured. Time to install the computer's RAM memory cards. These two cards go into the blue slots found just to the left of where the cards are placed in this image. Simply line up the gaps with the pegs inside those slots and then press down firmly until the clips at either end clip in and make a snapping noise or distinct clicking noise. That will tell you that they're securely in place. Try to avoid placing the cards directly beside each other and try to match them up with the appropriate colored slot. Now it is time to place the motherboard inside and secure it to the case. Make sure you lamp the screw holes of the motherboard with the brass pegs you prepared earlier, and then screw in the screws provided by the case packaging so that the motherboard is now securely added to the case. Now to add the video card. Select one of the long horizontal PCI slots below the heatsink and remove any additional paneling from the case directly left of that slot. That space is where the external ports of the video card will go. Slide the video card straight down to the slot with the external ports of the video card facing out the back of the case. Press down gently until you hear a click, sounding that the video card is now secured to the motherboard. Then be sure to secure the video card with a screw from the back of the case. Now to install the hard drive and DVD-ROM drive. The hard drive bays come with locking clips to hold the hard drives in place. Slide the hard drive into one of the bays with the hard drive ports facing the motherboard. Then use the locking clip to lock the hard drive in place. You do the exact same thing with the DVD-ROM drive, but instead you insert it to the front of the case and then secure it with a locking clip. Both of these parts will need to be secured firmly in place with screws on the opposite side of the case. Finally, the power supply goes to the bottom of the case with the plug and power switch facing out the case through the large square hole at the bottom back of the case. Use more of the screws that came with the case to secure the power supply from the back. Now it is time to start wiring all the components together. This process would normally be really difficult, but luckily, component manufacturers have started color coding each of the cables and locations, so it's much easier to identify where they go. These blue SATA cables are designed to connect the hard drive and DVD-ROM drive to the motherboard, matching up with those small blue ports on the motherboard you can see beside my hand. Here's what they look like when everything is in place. This assortment of multicolored wiring is the case wiring. They go along the very bottom of the motherboard in very well labeled and color-coded pins and slots. It is very easy to follow and to understand. This is what it looks like when everything is in place. Finally is the power supply wiring. Even though there's a ton of these wires, it is very simple to do. All the ports and plugs are designed with only a specific plug or port in mind, so it's very hard to mess up or make a mistake as long as you don't try to force anything too hard. The final step is to test to make sure that your computer is working at this point. So once you've plugged in all your cables, your monitor, your keyboard, and of course your power supply, and turn the machine for the first time, your goal is to have the machine do something called posting. The screen you see here is one of the potential posting screens you should see, and the other screen is very similar. It will vary depending on your model, but as long as you get these screens, you know that your computer is working properly. That concludes this video. Our next video will be covering OS installation.